School administrators, board members, and community leaders gathered this week to hear how the legislature may, beginning next year, consider a new funding formula for schools. David Little, who is the executive director of the Rural Schools Association of New York State, hosted a forum at Champlain Valley Educational Services in Plattsburgh, where he also discussed some of the biggest issues and challenges facing rural schools. In other states, communities have joined together to build regional high schools that Little says in many ways offer students more opportunities.
We've been trying to figure out forever, what do we do about the problem of rural schools not having a broad enough curriculum to allow their graduates to be competitive with urban and suburban graduates? For as long as I've been around, that's been an issue. And it's particularly acute right now. Well, every single state that surrounds New York State has addressed that problem for 2 generations with regional high schools. And we have 4 of them in New York, but they're only on Long Island. And we haven't figured out how to make it work in New York. To me, it's a solution just waiting to be tapped. You can't go farther than 30 miles anywhere in this state without hitting either a community college or a SUNY campus. Tremendous resource spread throughout the state, okay? And they're hurting for students, and we need a place and a structure. And why we aren't having BOCES work with community colleges and SUNY campuses to host regional high schools, it's a model that's been around forever, and we haven't figured it out.
Little also heard from administrators and board members who said the lack of advanced college courses is putting students attending smaller rural schools at a disadvantage compared to the early college courses and credits available to students in more urban communities. Others at the forum also questioned costly state mandates, like those requiring districts to begin converting their fleets of school buses to electric in just 4 years. And David Little joins us now. Welcome. We appreciate you taking time to stop by and be with us today.
Oh, happy to do it. Thanks.
Your organization works with about 300 smaller rural schools across New York State. Yeah. How many districts here in the North Country do you represent?
Most. Obviously, not Plattsburgh, not urban areas, not suburban areas. And we don't have a formal definition like a U.S. Census definition. Our working definition is if you think you're a rural district and you think we can help, happy to have you.
You have both large and small districts in rural areas.
Yeah, and we have to keep redefining. People say, well, you represent small districts, and I have to say, well, are you talking in terms of population or geography? Because they may be huge districts, you know.
Exactly. You held a forum here in Plattsburgh this week asking school administrators and board members to share their biggest concerns with you, the challenges and obstacles that their rural districts are facing. And you're holding these listening sessions all across the state?
Yeah, about a dozen of them. So by the time we get done, we ought to have a pretty well-rounded, well-represented batch of information to be able to form a policy brief and advance that to state leaders and even federal leaders to try and address some of the concerns that have been listed in the forums.
And what are some of the biggest concerns you're hearing?
Well, typically always, and we're only about 4 into 12, so I don't want to speak for the totality before we've heard everybody, but this is the second round of these kind of forums that we've done, and so we've got a pretty good idea of what people are concerned about. Obviously, finances are actually, for the first time in the 40 years that I've been involved in one end or another of public education, finances have always been a concern, and we've got a very brief interlude right now where both the state and federal governments have made substantial investments in public education. But the next big thing to do is to figure out what they do when that money dries up from the federal government. The state will have fully funded its obligation under a court case from a generation ago. So the what do we do now question. We've got tremendous inequity that remains despite the economic investment in our public schools. You know, we have districts in Westchester County and other places that have tremendous local resources, and then we have small rural districts that have very little of their economy left after the Great Recession and then the pandemic. And so, and even if they had some, you still have the tax cap that limits their ability to now build up. Once you're down, it's very hard to build back under our current system. And so we need to try and take the information we glean from these forums, talk to state leaders about the new way to create the next generation of a formula that meets the needs of this generation. And just as an example, our current formula says nothing about student mental health. One of the largest concerns that we have with our children coming out of the pandemic, and yet there's nothing in the formula that addresses student mental health. Particularly, again, rural children who much more severe than some of our other populations were very isolated during the pandemic. Their homes are far away from friends. Their school may be the only place where there's internet access. And so once they got home, or if their school wasn't in session because of the pandemic, so they have issues. Kids are going into high school that are exhibiting elementary school type reasoning because the last time they were in that setting, they were in elementary school. You know, they kind of skipped the whole middle school process because of the pandemic. So this fixation we have on basing everything on how many kids you've got today in your school really doesn't address what do the kids in your school need today. And so we need to figure out a way to work that into the formula.
And lawmakers know that. They know they have to think about coming up with a new formula. They may decide to keep things status quo, but you're going to push for them to really reconsider how they come up with a formula, especially for rural schools.
Now that everybody has received the money that they were due a generation ago under a court case that the state agreed to, they've now fulfilled that. It literally took them the entirety of a child's public educational career from kindergarten to their senior year in high school to do that. But now that they've done that and everybody has their money under the old formula, the likelihood is that they'll just provide everybody an across-the-board increase or decrease of a certain percentage. And that's the singularly most inequitable way to distribute state money. It means it doesn't matter what you need versus what I need, we're going to give you all the same thing. And so if you happen to be a high-need district, you'll stay high-need because you're not going to get the resources to even that out.
And you mentioned COVID. 3 years later, the masks, the mandates, the social distancing are gone. But is COVID still having a negative effect on our school districts and on our kids?
Well, it is to the extent that it has a negative effect on individuals. You know, it's not like we're back in school, so everything's back to normal. No, I'm back in school as a high schooler when I've skipped 2 years. You know, and I've tried to muddle through that time period doing instruction at home, which all the studies that, you know, are obviously short-term studies because of the time period involved, but they're all pointing to the fact that that instruction was not the same thing as being in a classroom. They're trying to play catch-up. But we've got this state money, federal money, and coming out of the pandemic with everybody having kind of the latitude to try something. We want to build back better than before. We don't just want to catch up where we were 2 years ago. We've got to create something new that'll go forward that will be better, right? That will help us make up this time for kids. And so we've been given tremendous latitude as schools to try and be creative. And I think many schools have done that. Some things still stand in our way. The state of New York has just been intransigent on some structures that have been shown by all of the states around us to work. Regional high schools is an example. The state education department is now exploring that. There's legislation for that. But for years, the state has said, well, if you can't provide what you're supposed to provide, you need to merge with somebody. And nobody wants to do that. Well, the solution to that Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Vermont, everybody around us figured out 2 generations ago is have your kids go to the 8th grade in your local community. When kids are young, they need to be really close to home. Parents need to be nearby. We don't want them spending 45 minutes on a bus. But then when they get to high school and their curriculum needs to be much broader than we can provide at the local level. and they can't provide the breadth of curriculum that our kids need to be competitive with urban and suburban counterparts from around the state. And so everybody graduates from rural schools, high 90 percentile, wonderful percentage rate, and then they don't necessarily succeed in college or career after that because they don't have the backing. At the very least, they'll get to community college and immediately be told you need remedial work, because these classes that you're now going to have to buy on your own dime have been provided free of charge to our urban and suburban high school students from elsewhere around the state that happen to have more resources than you had locally. So the solution to that is, let's put 3 or 4 schools together. Well, the state of New York came up with a brilliant idea many years ago. Rather than having one centralized university system, they diversified. And you can't go farther than 30 miles anywhere in the state of New York without hitting either a SUNY campus or a community college. So we have these tremendous local resources throughout the state, and we have the BOCES system that already knows how to transport kids and how to educate kids in a regional setting. If we could combine the two, we have the ready-made structure to build regional high schools throughout our state where they're needed and provide children the curriculum that they need to be successful.
For school districts, state mandates can be frustrating. They can be costly, and you heard at the forum from some who are worried about the transition to electric buses, that for smaller rural districts, that's going to be quite a price tag, and yet there's a mandate to begin converting to them by 2027 and be fully converted by 2035.
This is a really classic example of the state saying, if we build it, they will come. You know, let's create the mandate, and everybody will work to the mandate, and we'll end up being much closer in 2035 than we would have been if we said, hey, we've got a grant program and we'll start, and if everybody wants to try and convert to buses, we'll try and help you do that. Well, nobody would. I mean, it's too costly. There are too many unknowns right now. I don't think there's anybody that's seen a group of elementary kids line up to get on a bus nose to tailpipe with a diesel bus that doesn't think this is a good idea, right? From a health standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, a great thing to not be running diesel buses all day long, right? Electric buses make sense, but it's got to make sense before it makes sense. You've got to logistically be able to pull this off, and you've got to provide answers that give people the confidence that they're willing to invest large sums of money, and you've got to identify how they do that. If I'm a small rural district and I have a tax cap of 2% and inflation is at 6%, tell me how I buy a $350,000 bus instead of replacing it with a $100,000 bus, right? I don't have the money. Somebody tell me how to do it, and we'll be happy to get there.
Probably the overwhelming majority of the concerns you hear from the school districts are fiscal and have to do with financial matters. Are there other key issues that you're hearing from school districts that are important to them right now?
We have some very good ideas. Besides regional high schools, the state has been very supportive of the idea of community schools. These schools that have lost enrollment now have space. And like the Bassett healthcare system in the southern tier now runs community-based health centers out of schools, partnering with the school, and you can imagine the kind of advantage that provides to students. And so using the school for its strength, which is as a centralized distribution point within a community, we can do any number of things through this community schools model. Libraries, dentists, after-school programming, summer program, all of these things that you would want to bring kids back to where they need to be coming out of something like the pandemic. So creativity along with some support from the state, to me, really is the future of our rural communities.
And along those lines, meals, there is talk about free meals for all students in school. Legislature considering that, would that be good for rural schools to have that?
When you provide universal meals, there's no stigma. There's no, this kid's getting a free meal and that kid's not getting a free meal. And so when the federal government said, we're going to pay for everybody to be qualified during the pandemic, that was a wonderful situation for a couple of years. Now that the federal government has chosen to pull back from that, It's going to cost over $200 million if the state wants to continue it itself. Fortunately, both houses of the legislature in their one-house bill, that program is in fact funded and would continue. That would be of tremendous help.
David Little, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.